Thank you, Congress. It's now my pleasure to invite Humza Yousaf MSP, First Minister for Scotland and Leader of the Scottish National Party, to address Congress. Humza was elected to the position of First Minister in March 2023. He previously held a number of key cabinet posts in government that involved him working closely with our movement on a range of key issues, a relationship he has continued whilst First Minister. We're pleased to welcome Humza to address our Congress.
Thank you very much, Mike, for that kind introduction. Many of you, of course, everybody here knows Mike and knows Mike well, a true stalwart of the trade union movement for over 4 decades, obviously only starting when he was 5 years old, Mike. Mike has been a tireless campaigner on issues like ending apartheid, on opposing nuclear weapons. He is, in my estimation, the very personification of all that is good and important about our trade union movement. That is standing in solidarity with the most marginalised, speaking up in defence of social justice and against injustice, whether that's at home or indeed abroad. So Mike, I'm very delighted at the role that you've taken on as President of the STUC. As always, Congress, a great pleasure to be here in the Caird Hall. I was being reminded by one of my colleagues the last time I was here in the Caird Hall, I was forced, and I use that word purposely, forced by the Pakistan Consul General on the Independence Day of Pakistan to come on this stage and do Bhangra on the stage of the Caird Hall. The first promise I can make to you today is that there will be no repeat of that this morning, unless, Mike, you're going to join me later. No, he says no. My special advisors will be immensely relieved at that. Friends, Congress, I can't believe that 12 months have already passed since I addressed you in this very hall a year ago. And I'll come to some of the highlights, including also some of the challenges over the course of that last year. Coming here last year, addressing Congress, having that privilege, having that honour, was, of course, the very first keynote speech that I made in my role as First Minister. And as I say, it's certainly been an eventful year, but also every single moment, without a shadow of doubt, has been an honour and a privilege, and continues to be to this very day. And if I have learned one thing from my friends and colleagues in the trade union movement, it is the importance of perseverance and commitment to what you believe in, to your principles. If ever I needed some inspiration to do just that, then I need to look no further than the award winners who have just received their award a moment ago. When I had the pleasure of addressing you a year ago, I spoke about what the trade union meant to me personally. I mentioned the fact that when I was growing up in Scotland, in the aftermath of 9/11, when there was a flood of Islamophobia against Muslims, I mentioned the fact that it was the trade union movement that stood in solidarity with me and Muslims right across the country to say that we stand in solidarity with you in defiance of Islamophobia. But let me also make another personal reflection, one that's more recent. And let me thank again the trade union movement for the support and the kindness that you have shown myself, my wife Nadia, and our family when our family have been, and unfortunately some of them continue to be, trapped in Gaza. Your messages of kindness meant the absolute world at one of the most, probably the most difficult time for my wife and I. So from myself and from Nadia, thank you to the STUC movement for that solidarity and support. However, Nadia's family, our family, is of course just one of millions who have been affected and are suffering the worst possible humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza. The Scottish Government and the STUC have stood shoulder to shoulder in recent months, offering, I would suggest, a moral clarity and vital political pressure when many others have all too often equivocated. And with continued uncertainty in the Middle East, I know that the message leaving your conference this week will be as strong as ever. See, at its core, I believe, and I'm certain this is shared by many members, if not all, of Congress, that ultimately violence begets violence. See, we have been unequivocal in our condemnation of the Hamas attacks on the 7th of October, and of course we call for hostages to be released unconditionally. But we've been also consistent in our condemnation of any regional escalation, be that Iran's attack on Israel on Saturday evening, or indeed the attack on the Iranian consulate reportedly carried out by Israel earlier this month. What we don't need is politicians talking up war. What we need is those who truly believe in peace to be empowered to deliver it. Because whether you are Palestinian, whether you are Israeli, it is working men and working women, not the political class, who pay the price for war, and that is unacceptable. That is why we stand shoulder to shoulder with the trade union movement, calling, demanding an immediate ceasefire and to the end of the killing of innocent men, women, and children. We call for an end to collective punishment. We call for an end to occupation. And let me be abundantly clear, we must see an end to arms sales to Israel while the atrocities of Gaza continue. As I've already referenced, the STUC and the trade union movement more broadly has a long and very proud history in opposing discrimination and bigotry in Scotland. The motion that was being debated just before we went to the award ceremony was just one example of that. You have, as a movement, stood against anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, homophobia, transphobia, every form of hatred. You have stood against it unequivocally. And I have mentioned that I've personally benefited from that steadfast support in my own life, and something that I'll forever be grateful for. And you see, politicians of all political stripes, they often tell us that they have a zero-tolerance approach to hatred. I have to say that that has been sorely tested in the last few weeks with some of the very deliberate misinformation that we've witnessed in relation to the Hate Crime Act. You see, as Justice Secretary, I was very proud to lead the Hate Crime Bill through Parliament, providing long overdue protections to people based on their age, disability, religion, sexual orientation, transgender identity, and variation in sex characteristics. Just as those protections against stirring up offences for race have existed for almost 40 years. The Act, as you know, of course, has now come into effect. And despite the expectations and perhaps even the wishes of some, it's taking place within Scotland's criminal justice system in a proportionate way. For example, statistics show the number of daily complaints fell by 90% within the first week the Act was in force. And frankly, we've heard a lot of deliberate, downright disinformation. The people who've not been given as much airtime are, of course, the everyday victims of hate crime, of which there are far too many in our society. We've heard virtually nothing about the people who experience hate while at work, frontline workers who, for just doing their job, sometimes suffer the most disgraceful discrimination, abuse, and threats. They may not have the most powerful connections to get their stories told, but friends, all of us, I know here, are listening to them. Because that, to me, is the very strength of the trade union movement. Solidarity with the most marginalised. That should be the message that undoubtedly comes not just from this Congress, but from our country, that regardless of who you are, whatever your background, if you're marginalised, if you're a victim of hatred, if you feel alone, then know that actually you are not alone, that the trade union movement, good and decent people, stand in solidarity with you and always will. And for me, there is a lesson, many lessons in fact, within our approach to the Hate Crime Act. But one of them is how important it is to stand by your principles, stand by your values when you know you're doing the right thing. Keep calm and carry on, as the saying goes. And in my first year in the job, there are many issues which I've strongly valued the input and support of Scotland trade union movement. 12 months ago, I told you of my desire to see more progressive taxation in Scotland. It was at the hustings that Ros chaired during the election leadership contest, where, of course, she put a challenge to each of those candidates, myself, of course, included, around our commitment to progressive taxation. I gave a commitment then about my promise then about my commitment to progressive taxation. And like you, I've watched in absolute horror as the UK government have put money into the pockets of the wealthy through tax cuts, all at the expense of the NHS and other public services. Coming in an election year, it's the most cynical and most short-sighted of political calculations that I have seen. And I choose unapologetically to make a very different calculation, one that's based on my values, what I believe are not just my values, but the values and priorities of the majority of the people in Scotland. So you see, if the choice is between tax cuts for the rich and investment in public services, then I choose public services. If the choice is between tax cuts for the wealthy or progressive taxation, then I choose progressive taxation. If the choice is austerity or investment in the NHS, then I choose each and every time investment in our NHS. And that, therein, is my promise to you and to the people of Scotland, that I will always, always be driven by my values. Those values demand that those who earn the most, people on the highest of salaries, pay more to ensure that we have sustainable public services. And I make no apology for advancing progressive taxation. And we may not have gone, or not able to have gone as far as everybody wanted or liked within our budget. But Scotland has the most progressive income tax system in the UK. The new advanced band, which came into effect earlier this month, builds on that progressive approach. See, the revenue we raise is being used to good effect in our budget, not just investing in public services, that is, of course, critical and key, but also investing in the transition to net zero, which leaves no worker behind. And let me be again abundantly clear on that point. There is simply no justice in a transition that throws workers on the scrap heap. We will not accept that kind of transition. That's why a just transition to net zero is what we will invest in. Our budget also maintains vital social policies, free prescriptions, an improved childcare policy to support working families, to get more women in particular back into employment. And while the UK government's actions are pushing children into poverty, our policies, the Scottish Government policies, like those that are supported by the trade union movement, such as the game-changing Scottish Child Payment, those anti-poverty measures are estimated to lift 100,000 children out of relative poverty in the coming year. It's not to say that we rest on our laurels. We don't. There is much more to do. And before I set out some of those Scottish Government priorities, let me talk about the big political event on the horizon this year that's very important for Scotland's future. That is the matter of the general election. I don't think in any way, shape or form I'm going out on a limb here when I say I think and I hope that this Tory government is finished. I'm certain that I'm not offending anybody in this room when I say that I cannot wait to see the back of them. Good riddance to the Conservatives who have heaped such misery on households right across this country. Virtually everything that they have done, from 14 years of austerity to dismantling the welfare state, the disaster of Brexit, the demonisation of migrants and refugees, and their complete and utter abysmal handling of the economy has made life harder for ordinary families, for working people, for minority groups up and down this country. To paraphrase that famous Prime Minister who once represented this very city of Dundee in the House of Commons, never in the history of UK politics has so much damage been done to so many by so few. And therefore, this upcoming general election, whenever it may be, is going to be, in my estimation, a choice of values. It's about who will stand by their principles and stand by the interests of working people here in Scotland. In my first year in office, I'm proud to have delivered progressive taxation in Scotland, a direct ask of the STUC. I'm proud that we increased the Scottish Child Payment. I've been unequivocal in my support for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, continuing to demand an end to UK arms sales to Israel. It's clear that Sir Keir Starmer is going to be the next Prime Minister of the UK, which is why earlier I wrote to him a number of months ago now, offering to meet with him so we could discuss how the Scottish Government can work constructively with any future UK Labour government in the interests of the people of Scotland, how we could reverse 14 years of austerity, how we could lift, for example, the two-child limit, how we could replicate the Scottish Child Payment right across the UK. And I'm disappointed that months on, I've not even had the courtesy of a response to that. Because I know people in this country want to see politicians put aside their differences so that we can work together in the interests of households in Scotland and indeed across the UK. So you can be, as a Congress and as a movement, abundantly clear about what I and my SNP colleagues stand for. What are our values? See, we will support increased investment in public services, not a continuation of Tory tax plans and Tory spending plans. We'll support measures to strengthen workers' rights. We'll oppose any attempts to water down commitments that have already been made. We'll support measures to tackle poverty. We want to see a child payment rolled out right across the UK. We'll continue to lead the opposition to a two-child cap and the abhorrent rape clause. Let's be abundantly clear. There's no fair way of applying the rape clause. The only fair thing to do with the rape clause is consign it to the dustbin of history. And let me also be clear that SNP MPs will always advocate for justice and compensation for the WASPy women who've been let down so badly by Westminster governments over the years. And we will always oppose the wasting of hundreds of billions of pounds on weapons of mass destruction. Money which could and should be invested in our people and our public services. See, these are my values. These are my party's values. And every single politician standing for election in the upcoming general election should be judged on their values. You see, Keir Starmer's values will see him lift the cap on bankers' bonuses, but not lift the two-child benefit cap. Those are, in my estimation, the wrong values and the wrong priorities. So in this election, Scotland has a choice of values. I'll be calling on people to vote for what they believe in, vote for a progressive future, vote for the Scotland that I think we all want to see. Congress and I look forward, as leader of the SNP, to engaging with the trade union movement over the next few months as we set out our plans for the Westminster election. But let me also set out a bit more in terms of the Scottish Government's priorities for the year ahead. Last year I told you of my positive working relationship with trade unions in each of my roles in government, something I'm delighted was recognised and mentioned by Mike in his kind introduction. And I pledged to you that I would continue that approach that I've always taken. That's to engage meaningfully, engage productively with trade unions in the spirit of compromise and mutual progress. We know that doesn't mean we'll always agree on everything. Of course not. We know that there will be challenge from our trade union movement, often to go faster and to go further. And we will always work constructively with you in regards to that challenge. But let me also reiterate the commitment that where we can work with you, we promise to do so. Where we can stand shoulder to shoulder in solidarity with you, we commit to doing that. That's why I, my party, the government that I lead, will continue to stand alongside the STUC in resolutely opposing the UK government's appalling Minimum Service Levels Act. This act is an attack on workers' rights and completely rides roughshod over the devolution settlement. And as the secondary legislation continues to emerge, the government I lead will continue to do everything it can to keep opposing this unwanted, unnecessary, ineffective anti-trade union and anti-worker law. And for me, it's one of the critical, key reasons why employment law and powers should be devolved in their entirety to the Scottish Parliament. So that we can ensure that we strengthen those trade union and employment rights. And here in Scotland, we're already taking a very different path to Westminster, but I know with more powers, we could go even further. In the coming weeks, I intend to deliver a speech setting out precisely what could be done if we had full control of employment law. And I know there are, of course, differing views on the question of independence for Scotland, but I also know there's a lot of interest in what we could do with employment powers, and I'm very keen that everybody, regardless of your position on the constitutional future of our country, that everybody is involved as part of that discussion. It is my opinion, and it won't be a surprise to any of you, of course, that with the full powers of independence, we could do so much more. As the Brexit-based UK economy falls even further behind, a range of independent European countries of Scotland's size continue to point the way towards a more fairer, a more equal future as an independent nation. But I know that we need to do more to support workers and families here and now. My ambition is, of course, for Scotland to be a leading fair work nation by 2025, because tackling poverty, improving equality, cementing fair work and employment practices is at the very core of our economy. It's at the very heart of the ambition that we have for Scotland. In government, we're talking about taking actions that make a real difference, from our Fair Work Action Plan to our anti-racist employment strategy, which focuses on the barriers that women face, that disabled people face, that racial minorities face in our labour market, making it a requirement for recipients of public sector grants to pay at least the real living wage and provide an effective and meaningful voice for their workers. And as a result of the action that we've taken, we've seen a number of accredited real living wage employers increase significantly, from just 14 a decade ago to over 3,500 in 2023. And our support helps ensure that nearly 90% of employees in Scotland today receive at least the real living wage. But we want that number to go even higher. Scotland's gender pay gap is the lowest on record. We've led the way on annual increases in wages. This includes fair and sustainable pay deals, the highest starting salaries for newly qualified teachers, for nurses, for police constables, than their counterparts in the UK. So we've achieved a lot in the last few years. But I go back to what I've said already. There is still, of course, much work to do. And hopefully, if I'm invited back to Congress next year, I intend to be able to report to you on the progress that we've made as a government. And that other area that we'll be focusing on is tackling the climate emergency. There can be no underestimating the scale of the challenge that we face. Scotland is, of course, ideally placed to be a leader in the delivery of that just transition away from fossil fuels towards a net zero future, a zero carbon economy. We have an incredible workforce, unrivaled skills and experience. Business leaders from many sectors in Scotland are looking at how their technology and innovation can be applied to the race to net zero. And the Just Transition plans which we are developing will hopefully lay out how we achieve that just transition, that race to net zero in a sustainable way. And of course, in these plans, we'll be focused on energy, land use, agriculture, built environment, construction, transport, and of course the importance of a transition for Grangemouth as well. So delivering that just transition, everything in fact we do in government must ensure that we take workers, working men and women across this country with us in everything that we do. Delivering equality through tackling poverty, protecting people from harm. That to me goes absolutely hand in hand with growing a green and fair economy and supporting community by prioritising our public services. The trade union movement has always been instrumental in so many of the key achievements in our nation's history. So I end by reiterating what I said in the very beginning of my contribution, that we continue to work with you as the trade union movement to stand shoulder to shoulder with you in advancing equality, in tackling hatred and discrimination, and ensuring that workers' rights are put at the very heart and the centre, not just of our economy, of that, of course, but at the very heart of our society. And I look forward to continuing to work together as we make Scotland the best place it possibly can be for working people. And I echo that STUC message that workers do indeed win together. Congress, thank you for all that you do for Scotland.
Thank you, First Minister.